The postbox rattles on a summer afternoon in Amherst, Massachusetts. A folded sheet slips inside, addressed in a slanting, elegant hand. The envelope carries no return address, only the initials of a woman most of the town believes to be a recluse. Inside there might be a line of verse, a pressed flower, a wry remark about a neighbour. This is how Emily Dickinson lives through the slot in a village door. She was born on the 10th of December, 1830, in a brick house on Main Street that her family called the Homestead. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a lawyer, a congressman and the long-serving treasurer of Amherst College. Her mother, also named Emily, was quiet and often unwell. There were 3 children, Austin the eldest, Emily the middle and Lavinia the youngest. In this respectable household of New England Calvinism, Emily grew into a poet almost no one outside her family would truly know. The 19th-century American post was a revolution she used to its fullest. Postage rates fell, delivery grew reliable, and the letter became the private telephone of the age. In the small college town of Amherst, mail arrived several times a day. Emily wrote to family across the yard, to friends across the country, and to editors she had never met. Roughly 1,000 of her letters survive, though scholars believe she sent many thousands more. Her earliest surviving letters date from her years at Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. She wrote to schoolmates like Abiah Root and Jane Humphrey, with a wit already sharpened beyond her years. She teased, quoted scripture, mocked sermons and confessed spiritual doubt. When her brother Austin left home to teach and later to study law, she flooded him with pages of news and needling affection. The letters show a mind already in love with its own voice. Edward Dickinson expected propriety from his household, and Emily gave him both obedience and quiet subversion. She baked his bread each morning, tended the garden, and copied out poems by night. The homestead sat on Main Street beside a second Dickinson property called the Evergreens. There Austin lived after his marriage in 1856 to Emily's dearest friend, Susan Huntington Gilbert. Between the 2 houses ran a well-worn path, and along it passed hundreds of notes. Susan Gilbert was the great and complicated companion of Emily's letter-writing life. More than 250 letters and poems from Emily to Susan survive, spanning nearly 40 years. They begin as schoolgirl confidences and swell into passages of extraordinary tenderness. In one letter of 1852, Emily begged Susie to come home the next Saturday and be her own again. Scholars still debate whether this language is romantic, sisterly, or simply the idiom of the age. By the late 1850s, the letters begin to carry something else, poems, folded inside or copied at the foot of the page. Emily was assembling small hand-sewn booklets of verse, later called fascicles by her editors. Almost none of this work would be published while she lived. Only about 10 of her nearly 18 poems appeared in print during her lifetime, most anonymously and most altered by editors. The post, not the printing press, was her chosen medium. In April 1862, she read an essay in the Atlantic Monthly called Letter to a Young Contributor. Its author was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, abolitionist, Unitarian minister, and future colonel of a black regiment in the Civil War. He had invited unknown writers to send him their work. On the 15th of that month, Emily Dickinson, aged 31, sat down and wrote to a stranger. Her opening question has become famous. She asked Higginson whether he was too deeply occupied to say if her verse was alive. She enclosed 4 poems and a separate card bearing her name, so that her signature would not touch the page. Higginson was baffled, intrigued, and never quite equal to what had arrived. He would later call her his half-cracked poetess, and yet he preserved every letter she sent. To Higginson, she offered a self-portrait that has haunted readers ever since. She was small like the wren, she wrote. Her hair was bold like the chestnut burr, and her eyes were like the sherry the guest leaves in the glass. She sent him poems he could not fully understand and would not print. When he finally came to Amherst in 1870, he wrote to his wife that he had never met anyone who drained his nerves so much. There were other correspondents, other threads of the invisible network. Samuel Bowles, the fiery editor of the Springfield Republican, received dozens of her letters and printed a handful of her poems, usually without her leave. Josiah and Elizabeth Holland, family friends in Springfield, kept up a warm decades-long exchange. The Reverend Charles Wadsworth of Philadelphia, whom she met only twice, seems to have meant something profound to her. When he died in 1882, she called him her shepherd from little girlhood. Sometime in the early 1860s, Emily Dickinson began to withdraw from the world beyond her door. She stopped attending church, then stopped leaving the garden, and at last stopped leaving the house. Visitors were received through a half-closed door, or not at all. She dressed increasingly in white. And yet from that shrinking physical world the letters poured out in undiminished flood, the seclusion and the correspondence rising together like two halves of a single act. After her death, her sister Lavinia opened a locked cherry chest in Emily's bedroom. Inside lay hundreds of poems, and among the papers were 3 drafts of letters that would puzzle the world for more than a century. They are known now as the Master Letters. Each is addressed to a man Emily calls only Master. No envelope, no postmark, no name, only the drafts in her handwriting, apparently never sent. The 3 drafts are usually dated to around 1858, 1861 and 1862. Their tone is anguished, ecstatic, self-abasing and strange. In one, she asks Master to imagine seeing a bullet hit a bird, and the bird insisting he was not shot. One might weep at his courtesy, she writes, but one would certainly doubt his word. She calls herself Daisy and begs and half apologizes, and yet apparently never sent the letters at all. Who was Master? The candidates have multiplied for generations. Some scholars name Samuel Bowles, the editor whose visits unsettled the whole homestead. Others name Charles Wadsworth, the Philadelphia minister she had loved from afar. A few propose that Master was no single man at all, but a composite or a fiction or God or the muse of poetry itself. The record, in truth, is silent. What the record does show is that in the last years of her life, Emily conducted a very different sort of romance, and this one by post. Judge Otis Phillips Lord, an old friend of her father's, became after his wife's death her constant correspondent. Her drafts to him survive, warm, teasing, and unmistakably ardent. She appears to have refused his proposal of marriage. She kept writing to him almost until the day he died in 1884. Across her lifetime, the boundary between letter and poem grew almost impossible to trace. She sent verses as gifts wrapped around flowers, tucked into condolences, folded into thank-you notes for a loaned book. A neighbour's child once received a poem on a slip of paper with a gingerbread cake. Editors would later separate the poems from their letters, tidying them into volumes. Something of the original meaning, many believe, was lost in the sorting. Emily Dickinson died at the homestead on the 15th of May, 1886, of what her doctors called Bright's disease. She was 55 years old. Her final known letter, written days before to her cousins Louise and Frances Norcross, contained only 2 words and a signature. Little cousins, she wrote, called back. It was, in its way, the perfect close to a life conducted almost entirely on paper. What happened next has troubled scholars ever since. Lavinia, astonished by the poems in the chest, enlisted first Susan Dickinson and then Mabel Loomis Todd, who was Austen's mistress, to edit them. Todd and Higginson brought out the first volume in 1890, heavily altered to fit conventional taste. The letters were sifted, censored, and in many cases destroyed. The 2 households quarrelled for decades over what belonged to whom, and yet a great archive survived, and slowly, across the 20th century, the letters were restored to something like Emily's own hand. What emerges is not the myth of the white-clad recluse, but the portrait of a woman in ceaseless conversation with the world. She was master of none of them, and mistress of all of them, through the slot in a village door. The postbox rattles one last time on a summer afternoon in Amherst.